we are really focused as an organisation on the well-being of our people and how we can impact the well-being of the people that work for our clients as well. And despite our growth, this is an incredible business. Despite our growth, our spirit and our passion for what we do, and our very best efforts, some of us, me included, have felt incredibly lonely, whether that was over the last 2 years or throughout our career. So today is a really important day and a really important conversation, I think. I know I have felt lonely at times, and yesterday I posted on LinkedIn, and it's probably my most liked and most commented and most viewed post in the 6 years that I've worked in search. And the thing that surprised me when I worked in search is how much LinkedIn is a part of my world. I've got a really busy job, a really busy family, and yet sometimes I feel entirely alone, and that might be for a minute or for longer, but it does happen to all of us. I like to equate it a little bit with ageing. So we all get old, it is inevitable, and we all do get lonely, but it doesn't mean we have to be alone. You also don't have to be alone to be lonely. We are really delighted to host today's discussion on tackling loneliness, bringing the subject into the discourse around inclusion and diversity. And we have a really fantastic panel. Thank you so much for agreeing to take part. They've all been cajoled and persuaded and pleaded into doing today. And I'm really, really grateful that you've all agreed to take part and bring your different perspectives to it. Before we do full introductions from the panel, I'm going to hand you over to the chair. Liz is a legal director and solicitor at Did Law, Karen's firm. They are a specialist employment and discrimination practice. She's got really incredible, extensive experience of all aspects of employment law, specialising in discrimination and whistleblowing cases, with a specific focus on sexual harassment and disability, and has a particular skill and experience in dealing with clients with PTSD and other stress-induced disorders. So full of expertise to lead our discussion today. Alongside the day job, she sits on the advisory board for the Rights for Women. Elizabeth is also a mother of 2, including one very tiny one, and not only she stepped in at the very last minute, she's had not very much sleep last night, and she's only 3 weeks back from maternity leave into a new job. So I know... I don't need to say the next bit, which is I know you're going to offer her every support and warmth this morning and encouragement. Elizabeth, heartfelt thanks from me, the whole Eton Bridge team, the rest of the panel, for leading the discussion, and I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and I feel really happy that you all applauded me for stepping into the breach and also looking as if I only had 2 hours sleep, which I did. But anyway, today isn't about me, it's about the panel and the discussion on tackling loneliness, which obviously, as Olivia says, we've all experienced, and I, having just come back from maternity leave, am completely aware of being lonely at home with a 5-month-old non-sleeping baby whilst everybody else looks like they're having a great time. So coming back to work has been a great reintroduction for me to the real world. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our panel, and I'm going to work along this way, which seems logical. So firstly, we have Anusha Reddy, who has, as I'm told, deep expertise in talent, leadership and capability, with a special interest in well-being and relationships within organisational performance. And I'll get everybody to talk a bit more about their experience later. Next, we have Simon, who, like me, is 3 weeks into a new role, hitting the ground running as talent director at Drax Group. We had a brief conversation about the shift in his business, which you can talk about more later, and also has specific interest in ASDs, so autism spectrum disorders, based on his own personal lived experiences and those of his family. So another interesting insight. Emma Rose is the Group HR Director at Travis Perkins, and I understand joined during COVID, so understands what it's like to be onboarded without anybody else around you, so I'm sure we can all relate. Has a specific interest in the role of business in the community and also lone workers, which I think will have specific resonance today in terms of the loneliness topic. Next, we have Julius Cordell, who has most recently been HR Director at Destination Asia, which is part of the Emirates Group. He has a background in clinical psychology, which is just about, I can say that this morning, in public sector Australia and also the armed forces. So from a psychological perspective, I'm sure he'll have a lot to tell us. And then last but not least, we have Bukola Bio-Yusuf, who is an HR generalist and Experian but amazingly, during the pandemic, founded Accelerate Black Futures, and is determined to create and maximise opportunities for the black community in the corporate world. So I'm sure another interesting perspective we can draw on. So that's a brief whistle-stop tour of the panel. So I'd like to turn to each of them to introduce themselves and also explain to us why this topic was something that they wanted to come discuss with us. So Anusha, I'll pass to you.
Okay, great. So thanks, Liz. I'm delighted to be here with all of you, and thank you to Olivia for keeping Wellbeing on the agenda. So this topic is really important to me, having grown up in South Africa, where separation and atomization of society was legalized. And I think that just led to an absolute fascination about the best and the absolute worst of human behavior. And it led me to become a psychologist because I was interested in how do you use science and evidence-based practice. Not just to sort of, focus on positive difference to people, but also thinking about business and importantly society. And then about 8 or 9 years ago, I had an experience in an organization where pretty much all the factors that damage well-being played itself out for too long. And I was compared to being a machine in that environment. And I knew it was time to move on, despite the many stay conversations with the CEO and the CFO at the time. But I think the huge benefit of that experience was that I became much more intentional in the focus on well-being, because it was just so glaringly obvious how much it mattered, but you also needed to protect it for business and people to thrive rather than languish. So I'm optimistic that I think together all of our actions can make a big difference.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here and to meet you all. So a few different perspectives from me. Firstly, in the day job as a talent director, workplace well-being and its link to employee engagement is very important. So it's part of what I do every day at work, I'm sure like many of yourselves. Liz mentioned my link to the brilliant charity Ambitious About Autism. So the charity is all about educating children and young autistic people and helping them transition to employment. In the UK, 86% of autistic people who have higher education are unemployed. So if you think about the impact to that on themselves, their families, and loneliness and the topics of sort of mental health, there's a big link there, and that's a passion of mine and something that I'm happy to sort of talk about. And then personally, my own journey, I've probably been on a bit of a roller coaster with my own mental health over my life. Probably done several years of therapy in total. So I'm a big advocate for, not just in my experience therapy, but speaking with others and talking about things to prevent loneliness, because I think loneliness exists in our own minds and it's something that is difficult to, but we can control. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you. Emma?
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Olivia, for the invitation to join the panel today. So I'm the Chief HR Officer of Travis Perkins PLC, which hopefully most of you would have heard of. I've been with the business for 2 years, and as Liz was saying, I'm really particularly interested in actually not just our own employee base, which is very distributed into small teams across the country, but also in our customer base, a lot of whom are lone workers and rely on the connection that they have with our local branches for their day-to-day kind of well-being and relationships. Previous to TP, I worked for Kerry and also Cadbury for 13 years, and I think that was a really formative experience for me because Cadbury was very, very people-centred, and a lot of the culture extended into the well-being of our colleagues and the connection that they have with each other. So I learned a lot from that experience. I'm also a trustee of Special Olympics GB, which is an organisation which focuses on providing sporting activity for people with intellectual disabilities. And I have a son with special needs, which is kind of what led me into the organisation. But people with intellectual disabilities are, like many people with disabilities, at very high risk of mental health issues, and people with intellectual disabilities particularly are amongst the most excluded in society. So we deal with a lot of issues through the organisation with our athletes around mental health and inclusion. I think fundamentally I'm just really passionate about enabling organisations to be more human, and I think that stems from really kind of a passion for authenticity and believing that connection is actually what really drives well-being at its heart. So I'm all about kind of driving agendas that enable people to be at their best.
Julius?
Hi everyone, Julius Cordell is my name. Background, as noted, is a psychologist, not clinical, actually forensic. So
My apologies.
No, it's not written anywhere. So a bit more of a specialism around law and psychology and the interconnection that sits there. Worked in police and corrective services as a senior psychologist, looking at welfare of staff, not the welfare of inmates. So a very big focus around, the corporate side of businesses and how we look after our people, especially when you think about having armed forces when all of our officers have weapons. Well-being all of a sudden becomes very, very important. We need to make sure that when they're in the community, they're going to discharge their duties properly and that we don't have any risk, psychological risk around them there. Moved through to HR, but then got pulled back into psychology again with the Emirates Group, so looked after their corporate psychology division, which was all of their business or organisational psychologists, their clinical counselling and EAP services based in Dubai, and then moved back into HR again. So for me, it's always been a focus around, let's look at who our people are, how can we make sure that they feel welcomed and engaged in the workforce so that we get the best outcomes for the organisation. So that's kind of my background there.
Thank you. And Bukola, last but not least.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Olivia, for doing this. I think this is a great opportunity. I'm really glad to be here. My name's Bukola. Everyone calls me B, I like to say. Day job is HR business partnering, so mental well-being and mental health is a huge focus. I actually support an OPCO member who's the sponsor for mental health at Experian where I work, so it's a huge focus for us. But similar to what was said, in lockdown, in the wake of George Floyd, I set up a CIC called Accelerate Black Futures. And I think it was a response to loneliness because I felt extremely alone in a company where we had 90,000 colleagues. A couple of weeks passed and there was just no comment on the team. There was nothing from the CEO, and I just felt like something so huge had happened, but it didn't seem to affect anyone else around me. So setting up the CIC, I have 3 children, we were in lockdown, it was the worst time to do anything other than just survive. But I was so passionate that, for 2 reasons. One, so I could say to my sons, Mum did something, I didn't just whine about it. And 2, to try and find my tribe, try and find people who are similar to me, who could share the same experiences. I have a background in HR, so I was trying to bottle development opportunities, but it was really, you boil it down, it was really to just connect with other individuals. So this topic definitely resonates, I totally resonates with me. And I think the pandemic has exacerbated everything around us in terms of isolation and making people feel even more lonely, even when they're in a crowd. So really excited to be here today.
Thank you. So from each of the panelists and their brief introductions, 3 words struck me actually, was human, authenticity and connection. And I'd just be curious for all of you to comment on how you maintain that human authenticity and connectivity in a world where everybody is either working from home, remote working, hybrid working, because I think one of the most difficult challenges, as we've said, is not having face-to-face contact. And obviously, if you then happen to also have mental health issues or are neurodiverse, that lack of face-to-face contact can actually, push you further down into a dark place. So if each of you in turn could give some insight into what your organisations are doing or what you as a people leader are doing to bridge that gap, that would be amazing. We'll randomly, Emma, you start.
Thank you for that.
Well, I just thought, it was you that talked about authenticity, so I thought that was a key point.
Yeah, I think obviously I joined TP in June 2020, so we were just coming out of the first lockdown. It was a fascinating time actually to be part of an organisation and observing kind of how it was dealing with the issues at play, particularly when I didn't know anybody and couldn't actually meet anyone in person. But I joined the week of George Floyd's death, and I think it galvanised us as an organisation around the subject of inclusion and belonging, way more than they'd ever really kind of had it on the agenda before. And so one of the first things I did was really focus on how we could ensure that everyone in our organisation felt seen in a situation where everyone felt quite hidden. We had, you know, the lion's share of our employees actually were in branches and working. They were kind of classed as frontline workers, but we started to kind of really build our D&I agenda, and we coined a phrase in the business which has become very much a part of our culture now, which is you be you, it makes us us. And I think that has really helped people to be themselves, to tell their stories, we were just talking actually a minute ago about what an insight we got into people who were working at home through their families and their kids kind of coming in. I was talking about an incident where I had where my son walked in naked when I was in a meeting. But I think we've all really appreciated that bit of insight into a bit more of that, who is the person that we see in the office every day. And I think it's broken down a lot of barriers for us. And I think that kind of you be you has just really encouraged people to be comfortable with that and be comfortable with bringing themselves to work. So I think that's kind of the first thing, certainly in my recent experience and through the pandemic, that really helped us to start to build that sense of connection and authenticity in TP.
I agree. Thank you. Anusha?
I think for me it's been a lot about leaders, just because of the disproportionate impact that leaders have on people and on their loneliness and sense of belonging. And just a couple of very sort of basic, simple things that we tried, which is about helping leaders to think about how do you lead with empathy and compassion for productivity. But also thinking about checking in and not checking up on people, both personally and professionally. And noticing that when leaders talk about what's happening with work, but also you're thinking about what's happening personally, it starts to connect people in a way and build deeper, more meaningful relationships, and the bonds between people solidify, especially when you bring in personal aspects of it. So it was encouraging leaders to do more of that. But I also think just simple things like asking the teams that they work with what would actually help us to build stronger connections. And to create a stronger sense of belonging in the organization, but importantly to listen, to act on it, so you actually then evolve the workplace culture, and you're starting to deepen those relationships and bonds. And I think the final thing I would say about, sort of linked to this theme, is that leaders themselves, feel a lack of belonging and are disconnected from their teams, from the organization, and they're also quite ill-equipped in terms of knowing how to sort of support people. So there's a lot of training in terms of making sure leaders are getting the right training so that they're supported, and you help to destigmatize loneliness so they're having the right conversations. And then building in those conversations around asking for feedback, giving it, asking for support, but also asking for help, but also giving support to others. Because we know that reciprocal relationships are good for our well-being, and it actually is a buffer for loneliness. So those are some of the things.
And I think asking for help is one of the key issues, and I think it's something we can expand upon in the next round of discussion. So, Julius, did you have anything about the former point?
Yeah, Anusha raises a really interesting point around leadership there and the need to listen and act. And even prior to the pandemic, when I was back in the police force, and this is going back many years, we had a real issue around suicide, officer suicide. And there is the stigma that sits with mental health, with loneliness, with reaching out, especially in military, paramilitary workforces and blue-collar workforces as well. And one of the things that our commissioner did, and we really encouraged this from a psychology perspective, was to be front and centre of it rather than sit back. So we had our commissioner come forward in the media and say, in front of the cameras, in front of the audiences, and really to his workforce, it's okay to cry. It's okay for my police officers to cry. And that was a pivotal moment for the organisation, where mental health became a key factor that we needed to look at, and officers felt more happy to be able to come forward and to talk. So that leadership, important to listen, important to act, and really important to vocalise what's happening within the workforce, to sympathise and empathise and make sure we do something about it.
I agree. B? Can I call you B now?
Yes, yes you can. I think the only thing I would add, just to emphasise the training piece, I think some people want to have those conversations but just don't feel equipped enough to have it. I talk a lot at work about psychological safety, and mental health is particularly not talked about in the Black community. So you almost want to have the conversation, but I think some leaders feel like I don't want to say the wrong thing. So I think education and just working remotely, it's harder to pick up on cues when someone's not doing okay. So what I do a lot with line managers, and culture is a huge piece, is asking the "Are you okay?" a second time. You know, you say if everyone goes, yeah, fine, busy day, and they kind of, and just really saying, "Are you okay?" And I think if that's infused in everyone, in the culture of the company, you're further along the conversation that you need to be. So yeah.
And Simon, finally.
Yeah, but building on what Emma was saying about you be you, I'm a big believer in bringing your whole self to work. And I think traditionally the workplace hasn't been supportive of that. I think certainly if we look back 5, 10, 15 years, a lot of people might have had a work persona and they felt like they had to be different in the workplace to how they did outside of the workplace. And I think that's fundamentally unhealthy. Like, we all are spinning many plates in our lives, you know, family, friends, our own health, our work, any charitable work that we do. And trying to think that we can separate those things doesn't work. So some really practical things that I've seen in the workplace that we've done to try and encourage people to bring their whole selves to work is creating things called a user manual of me, which is a very simple page whereby you talk about your own communication preferences, your strengths, the things that you find challenging, and also you share what you've got going on in your life. So what's happening outside of work that might impact. You do that in a safe environment with your team, small teams of people, so where you create trust and psychological safety, and you start building an understanding of one another, and then you use that as the foundation to have regular team wellbeing check-ins, a bit like what B was saying about, are you okay? No, are you really okay? Yeah. So having that part of key meeting agendas. Some industries might have health and safety check-ins, but why don't we all have wellbeing check-ins? So some simple practical things that I've seen that can make a difference.
I think the point about having a user manual for yourself is quite interesting because obviously so many of the cases that I see in terms of mental health are a failure to recognise those mental health issues, and they exacerbate, and then unfortunately someone comes to see me and we say, right, okay, well, we'll sue. No, but it is something that is a failure to engage and recognise from an early stage. So I think what I'm interested in from your perspective, because obviously I'm normally on the other side of the fence acting for the individual, is how do you recognise loneliness? Because you rarely sit on a team call and say, oh, I'm feeling awful today, I'm lonely. It's all, you have your work persona, and I know we can move past that work persona, but you don't want to admit that you're struggling. So how do you elicit that from somebody who may not want to communicate that fact to you, or is spinning lots of plates, or is just going down a dark avenue? What are the signs? What are the initial signs that you would say, right, we need to intervene compassionately for this person? Julius, do you want to start us on that point? Because I think you've got some insight.
Sure. I think loneliness is different for everybody. So, you know, you can see it manifest in different ways, but you will see changes in behaviour. You will see symptomatology around depression, anxiety, withdrawal can often happen there. A lack of enjoyment in normal daily life. Within the workplace, you could see a decrease in performance. You could see a reluctance to be with team members. You can see absenteeism, presenteeism, all of those general signs that we look at from a mental health perspective. A lot of that cues into what's happened with the pandemic around loneliness. So I think the other piece that we have to remember about loneliness is it's breadth and depth as well. So when we talk about loneliness, it's depth of relationships that we have with people, but it's also the breadth, the amount of people that we have contact with. And again, that's based on an individual.
Yeah, I think definitely individual, not one size fits all.
No.
B, any comments further to that?
I think the only thing I would say is, to Julius's point, changing behaviour is a huge indicator. I think having the well-being conversations and noticing, certainly in my job, I pick up on cues, and if I speak to lots of people, and if I only speak about work and they don't vary to anything else, for me that's a key. I tend to have a coffee with that person. It might be they don't want to do it in front of the team, one-on-one is better, but I think just paying special attention to little cues like that where people seem obsessed with just the one thing and don't have the lots of different other, you know, we talk about our kids, we talk about Love Island, whatever it is, and they're just literally, I just want to get the job done, it's the withdrawal, the I don't really want to interact. I think cues like that, instead of just ignoring and thinking, well, productivity is high, I'm just going to leave them be, it's the paying a little bit of extra attention to dig a little deeper into that. One of the things we've been doing is training lots more colleagues to be mental health first aiders. And I know it's not the end all and be all, but I think it's equipping people with the right terminology, language to at least have the conversations or spot times when they need to escalate it because they've noticed something. So that would be what I would add.
I think it's that recognition, isn't it, between, and I guess it's the age-old stigma of someone's behaving strangely or they're a bit weird, which unfortunately is a dialogue that still resonates, isn't it? And I think, Simon, that feeds well into you in terms of neurodiversity and ASD and how you need to change your approach to include that person, and what steps would you suggest that people take to offer that inclusivity?
Okay, yeah, big question.
No, just some tips or just...
Sure. So I think the work that the charity Ambitious does in the corporate world is look at how to change HR processes to make them more inclusive for people with autism. But I think the very nature of that is transferable to all people. Essentially because it's looking at the recruitment process, the onboarding process, and then across the talent life cycle. So when you move from job to job and you have a different line manager, when you're looking at performance management, what adjustments and accommodations are needed for that individual to be successful? So if we look at, say, a recruitment process, going through multiple interviews and doing an online assessment might be not very, very challenging for anyone, you know, in the context of the ambitious work for someone with autism. So it's thinking about actually how do we tweak those processes to allow that individual to show the very best of themselves so we can judge them on their strengths, their superpowers, their skills and abilities, not discount them on things that aren't their strengths. And then as you go into, you know, onboarding and then, you know, moving from manager to manager, it's the same thing. What standardized systems and processes do we have that exclude people or make it challenging for people and may lead to actually, you know, mental health and issues and not speaking up? So again, it's quite simple. You need to get good representation in a room to co-create and design together to think, how do we create processes, systems, ways of working that consider all people? Because we're all different and we all need different things. So.
I think that's important. So the lack of standardization, obviously there's a standard and you have criteria you need to meet. It's about being able to adapt to meet different neurological needs across the whole spectrum. And I think from the work that I do, it's realising that we're all on that spectrum. It's just how far along on it are we, and what triggers us and what promotes us to do the best that we can.
Yeah, I think we're all neurodiverse.
Yeah,
our brains all work
agree.
differently. You know, some people are neurodivergent and they have a condition which, you know, in my mind means they have superpowers in certain areas. But yeah, you're quite right. We all think differently. So.
But I think the positive in that is in the sense of embracing people's individuality, and taking that and allowing your business to take people's strengths and rather than seeing it as a weakness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Just picking up on something, Emma, that we talked about earlier, and also I know that is quite prevalent in Travis Perkins, is lone workers. And obviously loneliness and lone workers go hand in hand. So how do you as a business avoid that isolation and reach out to them to include them?
Within the business, one of the things that we've done is to, as well as the increasing the number of mental health first aiders, which I think has been a big signal to the organisation that we're taking it seriously, we have also done something which I think has been more successful than we ever thought it was going to be, where we had a number of branch managers. So, you know, they would be the first line management role in our business, very autonomous. They're running quite sizable businesses, but we would have a couple of thousand managers, it being such a kind of distributed business. And we had a few branch managers who were particularly passionate about mental health, and very conscious of the mental health issues we have in the organisation. The construction industry is quite famous for having a high level of mental health issues. And we actually took 2 branch managers out of their roles, a male and a female, both of whom had had a history of mental health issues, were trained mental health first aiders, were very good branch managers. We took them out of their roles and they became wellbeing ambassadors in the business, and they literally spend their lives going out to our branches and talking to the branch teams about wellbeing, and just listen actually to what's going on in the branches. And that has been so powerful, because I think there is still quite a lot of stigma related to colleagues talking to HR or talking to their managers around some of the issues that they have, and just being able to talk to someone who they can totally relate to, who's been in their position, who's done their job, has experienced the issues that they're experiencing, has been incredibly powerful for us. And it's given us, the Wellbeing ambassadors actually report through into my team, and it's given us a huge amount of insight into what actually will make a big difference from a wellbeing perspective. But the other thing that we're doing is taking that kind of support out into the community, to our customers. We have, and I'm going to call it an initiative, it's probably the wrong word, but it's called Man Down. So we've sort of framed it as kind of, because we're quite male dominated, unfortunately, and the issue of mental health in our industry is quite male related, men in their mid-20s to mid-30s kind of stage. It's called Man Down because we're asking our colleagues to look out for each other and through into the customer community as well. And that's also been really successful in terms of just catching some of our customers who may be having issues and need someone to talk to. And we actually have opened up our internal support systems to some of our customers as well.
I think one of the points you made there is about, well, people don't want to speak to HR, and I think that's obviously from the room we're in, that can be challenging, and that links back to stigma. So Anusha, in terms of stigma and the work that you do, how does that translate, and how do we move past that stigma and change our mentality in terms of people talking about not feeling 100% or...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point, and I think some of the research I read says 90% of people who experience loneliness don't want to share it with their managers, so it's not just HR. And I think there are a couple of different things. So, I think at a sort of systemic level, we know some of the things that influence loneliness and belonging, and they're actually things that have been around for probably too long that impact on overall well-being. Like lack of clear direction and clear expectations, not rewarding people for their contribution, when leaders micromanage people and you don't have enough autonomy and agency to get on with things. So all of those things have an impact and need to be addressed in the organization. But I also think that the more senior leaders in the organization have a role to play in setting the tone, because their actions will determine whether people, what people notice and pay attention to in the organization. And also I think it's something that everybody needs to get involved with and take responsibility for. It's not just the leadership, it's also employees playing that role. And then as people start to talk about it more and talk about it more freely, you start to help to destigmatize it and less people feeling ashamed about it. But I think for me, one of the other key things is also just helping people to understand how many people are afflicted by this. And actually, it's just our innate need to belong and to connect, and it's not actually a weakness. So it's really sort of helping people to sort of to talk about it. And I guess to sort of finish that, I would say that when you look at loneliness and the effect it has on our bodies, it sounds quite dramatic, but it has the potential to kill. And I think connection is the antidote to loneliness, and it has healing power for people at work and for a lonely world.
No, I agree. But you talked about stigma in the Black community in terms of admitting to loneliness or mental health. Do you want to provide any further kind of insight into that?
Yeah, so I mean, last year during Mental Health Month, I did a few podcasts, and I did research for it, and it was interesting to see things like, you talk about people going to therapy, but in the Black community, one, it's not talked about, and then if you muster the strength to actually go and seek it, you're talking to mainly white professionals who then don't kind of understand the problem and just kind of makes things slightly worse. So I think, again, finding your tribe is so important. You don't necessarily need, not discounting you, someone who's a psychologist or a therapist, sometimes it's just knowing that you're not the only
So a
one
like-minded
going
person.
Exactly. But I think, you know, we're starting to have those conversations now. I think what's important, again, is the psychological safety, where people feel like, you know, especially in the Black community, where there's already a sense of, oh, am I being discriminated against because I'm Black? Then on top of that, I'm going to say I've got mental health issues. Oh my God. So it's about creating that safety. One of the things we did last year during Mental Health Month was This Is Me campaign. And we had really senior people come in and just talk about lots of conversations that would never have come up in a random conversation. And it just sparked, I would be walking down the corridor, and I wasn't seen as HR anymore. I was seen as, I did a This Is Me campaign. I've got 3 kids, got a mum who suffers from depression, I've got this, I've got that. And people would just randomly go, oh my God, I didn't know that. I also do this. And it just kind of put down the boundaries of this is HR and this is, and everyone felt safe enough to connect. And I think if that is in the culture, and if that's something that they see senior leaders do, it gives permission, you know, to managers, it gives permission to everyone else to have those conversations and not feel like it takes away from anyone's performance. And I think if the pandemic has done anything, it has merged everything. There are no boxes anymore. I used to be able to do work and then come home and be a different bee.
And now it's in your living room. Yeah.
Everything's all blended in together. So I think we need to kind of upskill ourselves to deal with that. But I think, you know, being safe enough to have those conversations is really what makes a difference.
And I think recognising people as humans, as they have their challenges, everybody's got their balance, as I said, struggling with coming back to work, having a baby, all those types of things that men, women, everybody faces. So I think from my perspective, key takeaways from today are communication, recognising individualism, and championing differentials and diversity, and drawing from people's individual strengths, albeit different from the next person. What have you all taken away from today, and what key pointers would you give in terms of how you want to change the rhetoric or the culture in terms of loneliness and mental health within your organisation? If you can sum up in, you know, a couple of minutes. Do you want to start? Yeah.
I think my one key takeaway, I love what Simon said about almost coming in with a manual for yourself, because I think it does 2 things. One, it makes people actually think about it. I think sometimes you just are. You don't really think about your trigger buttons or what your preferences are. And I think doing that exercise actually helps. And then if everyone does it, again, it's that psychological safety of, as a team, I don't like X, I prefer this. And, you know, and I think that just keeps everyone in a known space to move forward. So that's definitely something I've taken to the team.
Simon, as you fed into B, how would you do dogleg from that?
Yeah, summarising, I think some of the things that we've all said, I think connection breeds belonging. So, you know, and then helps with loneliness. So working back from connection, I think we're saying psychological safety is a good sort of foundation for connection. And then one step back from there, I think showing vulnerability enables psychological safety. And vulnerability in any walk of life, let alone a workplace, and more traditional workplaces, is very challenging. So I think, you know, my takeaway is try and encourage vulnerability to create psychological safety to enable connection.
A T-shirt with that printed on it. That was really that was a good tagline. Anusha.
I think for me, just to sort of build on what everybody said, is that focus on our shared humanity, and just seeing people beyond employees and as human beings. And also helping people to, all of us, to appreciate that vital need that every single human being has to connect is as essential to our well-being and performance as having water and food. And so quite important, you know, as a takeaway to focus on, just in terms of how essential it is. And what that does is it starts to then build empathy in organizations, more compassionate and connected ways of working. And it starts to dispel the notion of our separation, and it builds interdependence on each other and also on the environments we work in and live in.
Thank you. And Emma?
Yeah, I'm just thoughtful. I mean, there's so many, there have to be so many different ways that we try to connect with people, because everybody's different and everyone will respond to something differently. The thing that I'm thoughtful about from this conversation, but in a day-to-day basis, is as an organisation, how are we consistent in how we demonstrate that that kind of willingness and compassion to hear people and to allow them to be themselves, because I think often we let ourselves down because we say one thing and then somewhere else a colleague sees something different that kind of undermines what we're trying to do in that other space. So I was just thinking about there's so many different ways, but the most important thing is that to get the authentic kind of connection with your colleagues, it has to be consistent.
Yeah, I agree. So consistency is key. So, Julius, last but not least, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess, as human beings, we're creatures of togetherness. We kind of want to be with people, and the pandemic stripped a lot of that away, except for our loved ones. Hopefully they're still your loved ones after the pandemic. But again, for me, sitting here talking to these guys, we all caught up last night and said, well, what's going to be valuable? And it was the shared experiences that we have, where we're all trying to go. When you're sitting there on your tables today, when you leave today, think about what can I do, what can I bring back to my organisation, what are the types of things, like doing this, like education, like connecting with leaders, like bringing people together, what can you do in your organisations, because it's through those discussions that we can work through this together and we get better outcomes, right?
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely key. So I'm just going to sum up to say thank you so much for the panel, for engaging in such a lively discussion. I'm going to pass back to Olivia to close proceedings.
I can't see Zoe anywhere, but she's up the back. So we promised everyone the opportunity to ask some questions.
Hello, and thank you for this really lovely panel. It's been a joy and a pleasure really to hear your thoughts. What would be your advice that, in some industries, showing vulnerability, reaching out for connection is considered to be a weakness, including by the leaders. It's really about, being a bit of a machine, working hard, and that's really what you want to attract, retain, develop, compensate really generously. How do you really advise to approach this from the HR standpoint? If
it's an issue that's hitting your organisation and leadership might not want to be looking at it, or it might be really taboo in your organisations or throughout the culture, bring in some statistics, bring in some data that's going to feed leaders who have a financial background, no offence. If we know that loneliness costs, from a workplace perspective, £2.23 billion a year in terms of productivity losses, attrition, and so on. You start to talk a language that people that may not have the psychological prowess to go, okay, well, this is costing something. We know from an NHS perspective it costs £600 per person per year just to deal with loneliness. I mean, these are massive figures that we're talking about. It's such a big concept that after the pandemic, we're all now talking about it at panels. So you can bring in different factors. I guess that's my side there, is maybe it's, if you can't get them on the psychological well-being of your employees, which I think you can go from a financial perspective.
Anisha?
Yeah, I think to build on what Julius has just said is, it's also to bring in some of the sort of psychology, the medical side of it. And so, I think talking about data, and there's lots of evidence around this now, that loneliness is becoming a predictor of early death, more than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, obesity, high consumption of alcohol, or lack of exercise. So we're starting to see a lot more of that data come through, as well as the impact it has on our bodies, from dementia through to heart disease, all of those things. I think that makes a difference. But on a very practical level, I think you can find pockets in the organizations with teams that are doing it well, and it will track in terms of how engaged those teams are, what their performance looks like, etc. And so you can use those as examples and start to build from there as well.
Simon?
I think I'd add on, adding on the data side, looking more at the emotive side. If we look at a leadership community, every individual in that leadership community is going through stuff and has gone through stuff. So if you can create a safe environment, an offsite, where the topic is culture, employee value proposition, values, behaviours, and basically encourage to share vulnerability, I think that's the start of maybe taking the leadership team on a learning journey to feel more comfortable with that, supported with data. I think that's a good start point. And then across the breadth of the organisation, if you have employee networks, colleague networks, which many organisations do, that is a great ground for having these discussions and talking. So you've got a kind of, groundswell, and then kind of education at the top level maybe.
Emma, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think fundamentally, I think people work for people. They don't work for organisations, and I think the what makes a good leader has fundamentally changed. And I think even, you know, the most kind of traditional leaders recognise that to get the best out of people, you have to change the way you lead. But I think generally speaking, leaders find it very difficult to show vulnerability and to tell their stories. And so I think the way I work in our organisation, we've done a lot of storytelling, and actually we've had some incredibly brave and courageous people in the business who've told their stories, who have actually been quite deep into their business, but they have become leaders of our leaders in doing that. And I think through the conversations I then have with them, if they happen to tell me something that I think, you know, people would really benefit from hearing, and they would recognise that how much it would help other people, I kind of try and encourage them to be more open about the story. And it's step by step, but I think you know, I think that fundamental truth around people working for people, and actually it's how you engage and connect with your team that gets the best out of them, is it's part of what we have to do as leaders today. So they need to move with it.
Morning everyone. Thanks to the panel for such a great discussion during this week of mental health awareness. So from the perspective of neurodiversity, I'm currently researching this in terms of accessibility in the workplace, and I'm very interested in the mental health component of that. I wonder if any of you have any insight or experience of how to overcome those barriers to make it easier for workers to have access and succeed and, I guess, thrive in the workplace.
I think some of the discussion earlier was around changing processes and ways of working to better enable, firstly, entry into the workplace, and then confidence, security, and an environment where you can perform to your high standards in the workplace, which requires accommodations and adjustments, right? So I think I'd really go back to that and reiterate that. I think it's on large corporates in particular, who have obviously a big buying power in terms of the talent that they employ, to make those changes at all levels, which then creates accessibility and durability as well. I think that's probably at the core of it from my perspective.
Emma, anything you'd add from your perspective?
I was just thinking of one of the guys in our business called Gavin, who is autistic, but only diagnosed, he's probably in his 40s, but only diagnosed in the last few years. And he's become a complete hero in our business because he's so courageous in talking about what he needs and the circumstances where he can be at his best. He has an amazing story. He started life emptying the bins in Travis Perkins branches, and now he's a qualified senior accountant, having grown up and been trained and done apprenticeships and things with Travis Perkins. He's got an amazing story. But one of the things that really struck me was when we started to come back to work after lockdowns and things, he talked about the challenges for him. So we have a very relationship-driven culture. People love being together, desperate to get back into the office, really kind of looking forward to it. And he was saying, hang on a minute, for those of us who have different needs, are neurodiverse, this is a really stressful situation. And we'd moved to kind of free desks, and we changed the whole office while everybody was out. And he was saying, I need to be able to book the same desk every time I come in, and I'd like to know who's going to be around me, and I want to come in on the same days of the week. And we'd made that quite difficult for him. And I think just, again, it's kind of, if we can create the relationship with your colleagues where they'll tell you and talk to you about what they need, then I think it's much easier to respond rather than them sitting there thinking, well, no one's doing anything for me. But you do need those people who are going to be brave and be the kind of first movers to have these conversations. But he's an absolute hero in our business now.
Good morning, and thank you, everyone. Yeah, I to some extent picking up on what Emma was saying, because I think it's fascinating, isn't it, that we've probably got conditioned to being, that regularity of getting out, going to work, being the norm, being the okay part of our lives. But actually, I think for a lot of people, the last 2 years has been more connected. So in contrast, two parents getting the kids up together, getting them off to school, and then balancing the day between them. versus one parent getting up early, getting on a tube to work, which is probably the most disconnecting part of the day. So we're certainly seeing that huge range of appetite to come back to work, because frankly some people have either got used to the norm of physiological being alone, loneliness, or it was preferable. Who do you think is getting it right in terms of that, encouraging people into the workplace versus beating them with a stick to get back? You know, it's a tough line to take.
I think it's more obvious who's getting it wrong than who's getting it right.
Any examples you guys would like to share where you've seen things are getting right? Emma, you're right, there's some very high profile examples, in my view, of organisations who are getting it ever so slightly wrong.
I think some of the things that are important to think about are how do we retain hyper-personalisation and choice when most organisations are driving towards standardisation and efficiency. That might sound very corporate talk, but I think it's that, how do you design for personalisation? And we've started talking a bit about it last night, actually, around different parts of our organisations and businesses have different demands in terms of, where presence in the workplace. So I think, it's a challenging one, but I think hybrid working and trying to create personalisation for the individual and choice is really important. So companies that are doing that, I think, are winning, certainly from a talent perspective.
I think the only thing I would add is what we're finding, certainly doing lots of research and talking to lots of different organisations, is making it worthwhile for people to come into the office. So I work in a global role, and so going in and being on Teams all day just doesn't seem worth the 30 quid I've spent and the hour and a half I've sat on the tube. So we have things like, tea and cakes in the office, or a day where you're guaranteed that the office will be heaving, so you see people, or making sure you've got stand-up. So you just need to make it worthwhile. I think I was saying earlier, I went into the office 2 days in a row, and my body completely shut down 2 days after, because I'm just not used to going in every day. And so it needs to mean something, and I think that's the organisations that are getting it right are the ones who are focusing on how to make the workplace, mean something and collaborative, so people coming and they know, right, I'm doing more than if I'd sat behind a screen all day at home. So, yeah.
Anisha?
I think just to share some examples, but they're across different organisations. And I think, years ago we all thought open plan offices were a great thing, and the evidence says the direct opposite, because it actually makes people more lonely and alienates people. So I think you're seeing organisations starting to change the physical space for more connection, and that's a good thing. I think the other piece is around all the alternative forms of work that we see in the different arrangements and the virtual working. And so people don't belong to the organizations they work for, and people in traditional work arrangements feel a lack of unity with people. So you're also starting to see organizations think about, how do I broaden the scope to include the whole workforce? And I think linked to the technology piece, we're also starting to see organizations hold technology companies more accountable to say, you kind of need to reimagine and think about how you're going to create the technology that actually helps us to strengthen our connections and that prioritizes quality over quantity of interaction.
I'd like to thank Liz and the rest of the panel for their contribution today, and all of your questions as well. It's been a real joy to sit and listen to the discussion. There are a few things for me that I would draw out, and we will do a full kind of write-up after the event and share it with you. One that I thought was great, right at the beginning of the conversation, thank you, Simon, you said everybody's neurodiverse. Some of us have just got different superpowers. I thought that was a really great thing for me to take away, and I'm going to try and hold that one with me, so thank you. The need to be authentic, bring your whole self to work, how do we enable that in our workforces and the people we work alongside, is a thread really that has run through the last few years, definitely, of this conversation. But I think it was something Anusha said, you said it very well. We all have an innate need to belong. It's not an illness to need to belong somewhere, nor is it an illness to be lonely, but it is becoming an epidemic. So I think we can all do things to change the kind of reality of loneliness, whether that's transient or permanent. And I'm sure there are plenty of people in the room who would give you plenty more ideas of how we individually can do it, as well as from an organisational an organisational perspective. So as always, thank you so much for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you all. The Eton Bridge team will be downstairs if there's anything that we can do to support. And thank you very much. Thanks to the panel. And thank you.